So we've heard a great deal over the last day or so about radicalization, and there's a growing recognition, I think there was in the room yesterday as well, that this is an increasingly problematic term because it often serves to obscure far more than it illuminates. It allows us to package all of our uncertainty and confusion and say we have a word for it so we understand it, and sometimes that can be problematic. Today I want to complicate that a little bit by addressing what it means to be radical, both from a contemporary and a historical perspective, and connect it, and then talk about what connection that has with youth. And also then talk a little bit about digital media. As I said, I recently co-wrote the UN's annual youth report that will be published in a couple of months' time, and we can make that available if people are interested. This works, okay. So, some clarity I think is necessary here, and I think we should start by stating that defining radicalism isn't without its problems. Historically, radicalism has often reflected the predominant political ideology and social current of its time, either by resonating with some aspects of it or by emerging as opposition to the status quo. So the definition of what is radical is really dependent on the context from which it emerges. Many movements that were considered radical by their contemporaries and were even criminalized in their own time have over time gained acceptance and legitimacy and have now entered the mainstream. You can take, for example, the emergence of movements advocating decolonization, women's liberation, civil rights, environmental concerns, LGBT rights, any number of concerns over the last century or so. What does that mean for our discussion about radicalization? Well, it means that speaking about radicalism really only makes sense if you situate it within its own contemporary socio-political context. To put that differently, radicalism doesn't transcend time. You can't be a radical in an absolute sense. You can only be a radical in a relative sense, relative to your own society and relative to your own time. This is the definition I put forward in the report, my subjective definition, but we might suggest that radicalism involves at least one of the following: the acceptance or espousal of ideas, beliefs, and attitudes that clearly contradict or fall outside of the range of mainstream or acceptable views within their own societies. So, for example, the racist and intolerant attitudes of neo-Nazi groups in contemporary Europe would be an example of radicalism today. Perhaps not 80 years ago, but certainly today. But another way of thinking about radicalism is the employment of illegitimate methods or strategies in pursuing ideas, beliefs, irrespective of the legitimacy and mainstream acceptability of those ideas. So I'd hope that everyone in this room accepts that animals have rights and should be protected from unnecessary harm. But violent attacks on people and research facilities in order to stop them carrying out testing on animals would be considered illegal and an example of radicalism. So radicalism involves the transgressing of either mainstream beliefs and ideas or legitimate methods and strategies. And so it's found in the margins of the mainstream in both. But I should add that radicalism isn't necessarily a bad thing. One way of thinking about this is that the ideas that positively cause a society to change, almost by that very definition, have to begin life on the margins or peripheries of society. Change almost never happens from within the status quo. That's what change is. It's something different to the status quo. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that joining Daesh, Islamic State, or a neo-Nazi group could ever be a good thing. Of course not. But it does mean that if we have to think about this problem a little bit differently if we want to find solutions to it. Now, who is drawn to radicalism is also worth thinking about because it impacts how we devise solutions to it. And radicalism is generally understood as largely being a youth phenomenon. Historically speaking, youth demographics have been drawn disproportionately to these sorts of movements and activities, and exceptionally large youth cohorts, or what you call youth bulges, often make countries more susceptible to political violence. That's an image from the Cultural Revolution in China, for example, where we had the Red Guards, an entire generation, for example. And sometimes the very name of a group may sometimes reflect a youth demographic. The name Al-Shabaab in Somalia literally means the youth in Arabic. The name the Taliban from Afghanistan is the Pashto word for students. Okay? I guess most strikingly today, though, jihadism in the guise of Al-Qaeda or Daesh is almost exclusively associated with young men under the age of 25, certainly under the age of 30, but under the age of 25, and originates in regions that are experiencing this substantial youth bulge. And this is unintentional, but that image there kind of illustrates my point that I just made about radicalism being only in its time. So Ronald Reagan introduced the Taliban as being the moral equivalence of the founding fathers in America, okay, while they were sitting in the White House. Of course, that's not how we think of them today. But in their own minds, they're probably not that different in terms of what they think they're doing. They're fighting an imperial superpower, for example, using not dissimilar tactics. So our idea of what radical means does change with time as well. And of course, those of you who've seen Rambo 3 know who the good guys are in Rambo 3, fighting alongside Sylvester Stallone, okay? Now, we can identify certain critical factors which might make young people more susceptible to radical narratives or groups, and I'll deal with, I think, the three that I think are the most important. The first is identity crises and a quest for meaning. 2, political disenfranchisement. And 3, socioeconomic inequality. There are others, but these are the 3 that I think are most important. The connection between radicalism and youth stems primarily from this transitional stage of identity formation during this adolescent period. Identity crises inspired by a host of issues present a state of vulnerability, of heightened crisis, and might compel individuals to seek comfort and belonging in groups that offer a safe and welcoming community of like-minded outcasts, so to speak. Many European jihadists, for example, suffer from an intense type of identity crisis. They feel alienated from mainstream society, but also alienated from their parents' culture. It's a kind of cultural schizophrenia in a sense. And so in the absence of an appealing cultural base from either their parents or from mainstream society, a certain type of religion becomes the identity by default, in a sense. And it's not their parents' religion, I should stress. It's a certain type of religion, often Salafism or Wahhabism, a deculturated sort of religion. So religion provides a rejection to the identity offered by their parents, but also a rejection of the identity offered by Western society too, which these individuals feel has already rejected them anyway. And in some cases, it's easy to understand why they might feel that way. If we take the example of France as a case study and the experience of French Muslims, the public discourse in France is generally quite hostile to Muslims and Islam, broadly speaking, at least over the last few years. There's an ominous fear of Muslims, of the immigrant, of the other, and it's what leads to, amongst other things, the desecration of gravestones of Muslim World War II veterans, restriction on Muslim women's dress. There are #1 bestsellers like Michel Houellebecq's Soumission, which in these kind of classic fear-mongering ways imagine a future France overrun by Muslims, ruled by Muslims. But I guess most significantly, it's what's helped the far right, the Front National, come to victory in the European Parliament. This the slide actually reinforces my point. Let me quickly explain what this does. This slide looks at perceptions of Muslims in a number of countries. It's a survey. The light blue bar refers to the actual percentage of Muslims in any given country, and the blue and the light blue bar together reflect what the average person in that country thinks the number of Muslims are in that country. Okay? So let me explain what that means. So in France, for example, Muslims make up about 8% of the population. But if you ask the average French person on the street, they think Muslims make up 31% of the population. So they think that 1 in 3 French people are Muslim. Staggering disparity there. And that's reflected pretty much everywhere. Pretty much everywhere. And of course, if you take places like the United States, where we're seeing this very kind of anti-Muslim rhetoric going on, that kind of figure would be far exaggerated. How do you explain that? Well, part of it is the construction of public and media discourses on Muslims, and Muslims are beginning to be seen as a kind of unwelcome minority, in a sense, an unwelcome presence due to this kind of scrutiny. Now, in that context, it's not difficult to see how, for many French Muslims feeling under siege and alienated in their own country, an attractive religious identity might appear more appealing than a tainted national one. And of course, groups that prey on this kind of alienation end up benefiting enormously. Islamic State issues new passports when you travel there. And many of the people from Europe publicly burnt their original national identity documents in response. Some countries, France, Australia, others, have also talked about removing citizenship from their citizens. But of course, that only serves to reinforce the perception of Daesh as not just a legitimate alternative polity in the international world order, but also this kind of welcoming utopia. And I should say that most of the Daesh propaganda that we see involves, the beheadings and the burnings and the violence. Is actually a very small proportion of the overall propaganda. Something like 60 to 70% of the propaganda has nothing to do with violence. It's about welcoming, it's about utopia, it's about state building, it's about identity. But of course, we don't see that because we are not the primary audience for that sort of propaganda. The connection between youth and radicalism also stems in part from the exposure at this formative stage to new ideas, new outlets for expression, provided by both expanding social networks and also educational opportunities. For example, the university is historically the home of radical ideas, revolutionary beliefs, precisely because it's often the first heady, exciting exposure that students have to the political world around them. Many of the great political movements, which were no doubt considered radical in their own time, began life on university campuses. Intoxicated by new causes to animate them and struggles to inspire them, students are inevitably filled with enthusiasm and idealism, but often of a very naive and kind of unrefined variety. But that's part of growing up, of healthy political socialization and development. Students don't just experiment with sex, drugs, and music at university, but ideas too. Second point, the second factor I think is important is disillusionment and with an alienation from traditional political processes, institutions and structures. Young people often feel legitimately that the issues which concern them aren't being addressed through public policy, through politics, and that can sometimes result in a recourse to protests, to demonstrations. And where these legitimate protests on demonstrations prove unsuccessful or are suppressed by governments, individuals might begin to consider more illegitimate modes of being political, rioting, sabotage, public disorder, and even terrorism. So radicalism might be interpreted as one of the ways in which young people seek to air their frustrations and grievances and also seek out structures that presumably allow themselves to feel they're being empowered socially and politically. The third factor I want to talk about is socioeconomic inequality, and this is quite important, I think. High rates of global youth unemployment as well as other broader forms of socioeconomic inequality have been central to youth grievances over the last few years. The rise of anti-austerity and inequality movements throughout the world largely rests on these sorts of socioeconomic inequalities that disproportionately target young people. Indeed, the youth bulge within much of the Middle East and North Africa and the associated lack of employment and other opportunities for young people was widely held as being one of the principal precursors for the Arab Spring. Young people experiencing blocked upward social mobility might find solutions to their predicaments in extreme organizations and movements. Returning to France for a second, as the case study, the two young Frenchmen who carried out the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris last year hailed from the French banlieues, for example. These are almost ghetto-like areas that are characterized as environments providing a heady mix of unemployment, crime, drugs, institutional racism, and endemic cycles of poverty and disenfranchisement. And it's in these sorts of scenarios that radical groups might potentially offer an escape from a bleak future or a criminal past. This slide is about 6 years old now, so the figures are even worse. But I apologize for the color scheme, not the best colors, but the light green refers to the actual percentage of Muslims in any given population, and the dark green refers to the percentage that Muslims make up of the prison population in that country. So if you look at France, for example, French Muslims make up 7 to 8% of the population in France. Yet they make up, and this is outdated now, they make up almost 70% of the prison population in France. Let me repeat that again. French Muslims make up 7% of the population of France, but make up 70% of the prison population of France. That's a factor of 10 difference. I mean, that should shame us all collectively, that sort of statistic. I think anyone who tries to explain to you why France is the leading kind of exporter of militants to Islamic State from Western Europe, without fundamentally touching on this elephant in the room, or this structural inequality, is not telling you the entire picture. Let me say something about social media as well, very quickly, and youth audiences. The internet, and in particular social media, have emerged as a principal arena for youth political and social engagement over the last decade. That's largely a positive thing, I should say. These platforms help to level hierarchies of knowledge and power. They reinforce the democratizing and egalitarian sort of nature of the internet and the new media environment. But these technologies have also contributed significantly to the visibility, at least, of youth radicalism and extremism. How do we explain that? Well, principally, it's a function of young people being what are sometimes referred to as digital natives rather than digital immigrants. Digital natives are defined as native speakers of the digital language of computers, video games, and the internet. They're born into that world. Conversely, the rest of us, and I'm sorry to point out how incredibly old all of you are, but you're all digital immigrants. We are all digital immigrants. We weren't born into the digital world. We've had to come into the digital world at some later point, sometimes kicking and screaming. And of course, we adopt the aspects, but not the same way that the digital natives do. Now, for young people, there is little that's new about the new media environment. It's just the media environment. It's only new to us, if that makes sense. So it's just the media environment to them. And For this newer generation of political actors, most of their activities have some incarnation that takes place in the virtual arena anyway. So is it really surprising if their political activism or radical escapism also takes place within this arena? I've got 3 seconds, and I don't know how I'm going to finish this, but I'll say a couple more things. Now, one of the paradoxes of the contradictions of the new media environment is that despite enabling access to staggering amounts of information and data, exposing users to new perspectives and experiences, it still allows individuals to gravitate towards extremism because they find themselves in these very closed environments, which effectively cocoon them from alternative realities and interpretational frameworks. And these online spaces can act as sort of echo chambers. They don't have any debate, any dialogue. It's reinforcing that particular viewpoint over and over again ad nauseum, in a sense. It's very effective if you want to, pardon the pun, to brainwash, if you want, someone towards a particular viewpoint. And of course, IS has been very clever in invoking social media, but also pop culture in its propaganda drive. You've all heard of the hashtag YOLO, you only live once. Well, YODO, you only die once. Why not make it martyrdom? Okay? The bottom one is from Call of Duty, for example, the most popular video game of our time. For those of you who don't know, but when you play the game, you play as a soldier. When you die, you respawn. You come back as another character. This says, well, this is our Call of Duty, and we respawn in paradise. So playing on the same tropes that they are familiar with. I'm going to conclude now. Let's be clear that from the outset that radicalism isn't necessarily always a bad thing. Rather, radicalism usually indicates a political awakening for young people and the presence of latent energies and desires to change the world around themselves for the better. At the very least, it shows a dissatisfaction with the status quo. And in fact, we might actually contrast the political engagement of radicals, however problematic, with the widespread apathy amongst youth in recent years, evident from chronically low voter turnouts in pretty much all democracies. The fact that so few young people vote when they're first given an opportunity is surely a damning indictment of the state of young people's engagement in the status quo, something we should be worried about. Consequently, it might be more useful to ask how to divert the very same energies hijacked by extremists and radicals towards positive, healthy outcomes. There's an old adage that springs to mind: if you're young and you're not a radical, you've got no soul, whereas if you're old and still a radical, you've got no sense. It's very difficult to be a middle-aged radical when you've got a mortgage and you need to take your cholesterol tablets and take your daughters to college. Young people do engage with radical ideas, and through that interaction try to change the world around them, but also change in the process themselves. And that's an important part of development and political socialization. And that sums up really radical politics and how the role it's played throughout time, in a sense. One of the most reassuring things for us should be the fact that people who join IS are generally young. The ideas that these groups are peddling lose their currency as you get older. And I'll stop there, okay? Thank you.
Good morning. I'm very happy to be here with you all. I want to say thank you to UNDP and the Oslo Governance Centers for affording me this opportunity to share my experience with you. Yesterday we talked a lot about the process of violent radicalization, the key drivers, and we had a robust discussion that enforced what I believe to be now our shared understanding that radicalization is a very individualized process and there's no single pathway to becoming radicalized. It's dependent on individuals, and context is everything. We just talked about the socioeconomics, international, regional politics, regional religious ideology, and repression being just some of the underlying grievances, and hearing the very engaging presentation from my fellow panelist, Akhil, reaffirmed a lot of that. But I'd like to focus my remarks today on highlighting some of the things that are being done to prevent and to respond to violent extremism, particularly focusing on youth-led initiatives, putting the Somalia situation into context, and focusing also on gender-based violence. However, before proceeding to that, I have to say at Countering Violent Extremism, or PVE sessions, we always talk about the role of youth. We emphasize this, and we also acknowledge that youth sometimes are perpetrators, but we overlook the majority of young people that are not perpetrators, but are involved in positive initiatives that are preventing extremism. So even yesterday, the language around youth and the numerous mentions of youth being unpredictable, being impatient or rash, perpetuate the belief that youth have a big question mark on them, and we must tread on careful waters when it comes to them, as though they could switch at any moment. So I think that in itself is harmful. It's condescending, and worse, I think it's presumptuous. So we really have to train ourselves as well to be very careful about that we practice what we preach, and it starts with how we talk to and about each other. With that said, I'm still very happy to be here and to share my experiences with you all. Just to frame my context in Somalia, where most of my experiences derive from, in recent years, Al-Shabaab has suffered major setbacks, losing territory and support. Splinter factions have emerged, further disintegrating a once powerful group. Ideological differences within the group, the sustained military campaigns by Somali and AU forces, as well as the decline in support from communities, has led to an increased number of young people defecting from the group. In 2015, the Somali government has introduced a blanket amnesty program for combatants, which further increased the number of defections, but that came with its own challenges as well. Defections are only the first stage in a long process of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, a process that is fraught with many challenges in Somalia, as there is no formal peace agreement between the warring parties. Ex-combatants face a myriad of challenges, including stigma from communities, harassment, and arbitrary arrest by security forces, fear of retribution by the groups they left, and a lack of gainful engagement such as employ and education leaves these young people essentially in limbo. After the break of the civil war in Somalia, the founder of the organization that I now run, the Yemen Peace and Human Rights Center, launched a campaign to disengage youth that were co-opted into the militia groups run by the warlords, and he had a very famous slogan called "Drop the gun, pick up the pen," successfully targeting thousands of young people across south-central Somalia. 20 years later, we are still working in the similar field. With the shift in dynamics and the new phenomenon of violent extremism, we are now focusing our initiatives on targeting young people lured into Al-Shabaab by a variety of drivers and vulnerabilities. The ex-combatants who are received at the Elman centers come from multiple routes. Some are transferred from the government's defectors program, others surrender to their clans, and others are drawn in by former colleagues. We proactively work with security forces, rescuing youth detained without trial on suspicion of being Al-Shabaab members, and enroll them into our centers, as well as to prevent those very youth that have been in conflict with the law to not act on impulses of seeking revenge or retaliation for the mistreatment they commonly endure while they're in prisons. While defection have increased, Al-Shabaab's appeal has waned, but not dissipated. Hundreds of youth are still drawn to its appeal, within the country and also beyond within the Somali diaspora. Further compounding the problem, which I alluded to before, is the government's hastily conceived amnesty program, which has in many ways been a debriefing clearinghouse, contributing to mixed messaging and unclear legal implications for those willing to leave the armed group. Young people who defect or are detained in raids are held incommunicado for months. They are interrogated, and they are paraded before the media. A bigger number live in fear within communities that at best reluctantly let them back in, and then brand them as outcasts. They face continuous threats and extortion from security forces, and they live in extreme poverty. A bigger group of fighters remain engaged in Al-Shabaab, despite realizing the group's misplaced claims and false ideology. It's a pragmatic reluctance driven by their witnessing of the treatment of ex-combatants by communities and government security forces. So I believe it's imperative that all preventative work on violent extremism needs to target both combatants, security forces, communities, and improve the overall process of reintegration and taking into account the wider challenges and reduce the appeal for violent extremism. So our theory of change is threefold, and under this strategy, what we do in Somalia is we provide direct services to children and to youth and to women that are directly involved with armed groups. We help them to disassociate from Al-Shabaab and become disengaged. We facilitate social movements on youth leadership, on culture change through education, using our centers to both work with former fighters for their individual recovery, but to start the conversation within the community to dissect beliefs concerning reintegration, acceptance of these very people, and the community's own responsibility in preventing further recruitment from taking on. In many ways, we end up brokering the contact between the people's movements at the very grassroots and the state and traditional bodies to achieve deep and lasting change to the issues that youth continuously face. We employ activities such as civic education and policy work. not just responding to the affected communities, but working with the government to ensure there's legislation and policies to create a more enabling and preventative environment. We provide interim care centers in undisclosed residential locations throughout the country. Excuse me. We provide residential locations in areas in which we work. We provide the religious, psychosocial, ideological, vocational, economic, and educational rehabilitation and reintegration services. We work with charismatic young religious leaders to support those who join Al-Shabaab because they actually believe the ideology. It's imperative that for every grievance or driver which led these young people to join the armed group, that we have experts to dispel or alleviate those thoughts and feelings. And that can only be done by qualified individuals, but are also relatable to the demographic they are working with. Common themes that these young religious mentors discuss with formers include gender, jihad, violence, law, and ambiguous texts in the Quran. But they also import important life skills such as communication, critical thinking, and conflict mitigation. Through nuanced discussions on the ethics and etiquette of disagreement, as well as humility and the possibility of being wrong or misled, and how to come back from that. This is an important message, particularly when being sent from someone on the same level or in the same age group as them. These sort of one-on-one dialogues reveal the uncomfortable truths within ourselves, backed by real examples of supporting verses in the Quran. This is what really supports youth to reflect deeper on their very own ideologies that they once believed they had a very definitive position on. Excuse me. We believe very strongly in building the capacity of credible and influential voices that already exist within the community in which we work, and subsequently providing them with the necessary tools and resources to go on to educate their own communities on countering and preventing violent extremism. We found much greater reception and understanding and spreading of the messages that we have been trying to send of rejecting extremism when it comes from actors that already have influence in their local constituency. So we roll out a series of trainings throughout the country for local civil society organizations on countering extremism, excuse me, it's the weather change. So we rolled out a series of trainings for local civil society organizations on countering extremism, empowering them to then take the lead on facilitating these discussions in their communities. And we had local youth organizations training women leaders, religious scholars, security forces. And the purpose of this model was that young people that are already doing very important work were imparted with the skills and then given both the technical and the financial resources to continue to mainstream this throughout their community. So it's not another entity coming from the outside. In the past, there have been many grand conferences and summits and reconciliation events organized in Somalia, for Somalia, and often outside of Somalia on reconciliation. But what's always missing about this is that they take the elite actors that by name and in title represent a community, but are so far detached that they don't actually have the means in place to go back and impart these lessons of social cohesion. Another aspect that was missing too is that when people are taken outside of the country for reconciliation efforts, they're not provided with the resources to come back and actually implement it. And what we try to do in Somalia is to not only amplify the voices of thought leaders, but to provide them with the resources to do it in their community. At the moment, there's a plethora of actors in the CV, PVE space. The many different coordination bodies in place, the working groups, and all of that focus on this fail to adequately incorporate the perspectives of national organizations and particularly local youth initiatives. This is certainly an issue in Somalia, but surely in other civil society experiences as well. CVE has been looked at through a security lens, through a peace-building lens, and now more recently through a developmental lens. Yet it's still a very difficult space for civil society. And with the global attention on it now, it's becoming increasingly challenging, where governments decide the appropriate levels of engagement of civil society, where it is appropriate or not appropriate for them to be a part of it. And among the greatest differentiating factors that, at least I thought, between counterterrorism initiatives and CVE or the community aspect. Yet we're still seeing many of the same actors that are involved between CT and CVE initiatives. Because of this, the role of youth has become passive. They are not empowered to actually influence overall responses and prevention efforts, and our participation is frequently limited to implementing partners, although our actions and our influence within the communities that we are from are indeed transformative, and I think this is a missed opportunity. Because of the diminished ability of youth to contribute to conceptual issues, effective collaboration between the various governments and the international counterparts is also hindered. I've mentioned the positive examples where we in Somalia have been able to work with government directly in the disengagement and rehabilitation, but that's not to say that it's a perfect situation. We are harassed, we are threatened, and often excluded by government and security forces. We are not viewed as allies, but sometimes as a nuisance, forcing themselves into this closed space. I'm often asked, how is it that you do this work and that you are not targeted? To which I often respond, there is an odd sense of protection in being overtly exposed, where people know your mission and what you're about, but really the protection that we should be getting from government is not there. We're getting that protection through the recognition and support that we have from community. Which bears the question of how can we, as actors that are working to prevent violent extremism, work with communities to restore trust between security forces when we ourselves that are working with them are also at risk of unlawful arrests and disappearances and gross human rights violations. We need clearly defined roles and stronger partnerships grounded on mutual respect and cooperation. Another big challenge for young people working in this space is funding, access to funding opportunities, and exposure for youth to access different actors that are doing the same or similar work. It's important now that the world is acknowledging the plight of youth in this day and age. And the increasing declarations and rhetoric to support youth initiatives is constructive, but moving forward, it's also important to actually invest financially in youth-led initiatives to be able to continue what they do. The important work young people are doing around the world shouldn't constantly just be reinvented because you don't know about it, but we need more opportunities to share experience and learn from each other. I was to also talk about gender-based violence in my topic, and it seems I'm running close to out of time, but quickly, I'll touch on this. My organization, as was said in the introduction, co-founded the first rape crisis center in Somalia. Through our Sister Somalia program, we generated a discussion on gender-based violence that never before existed in the country. We went from a situation where you couldn't even help a victim of sexual violence, let alone do public advocacy around it. But now it's very much, gender-based violence is on the social and on the political agenda, with sexual offenses bills in place, a legal framework to hold perpetrators to account starting to shape up, and a society that identifies gender-based violence as a violation of human rights and not just a milestone in a girl's life. But when it comes to looking at the gender aspect of countering violent extremism or preventing it, women and girls are still viewed as just victims only, the spoils of war, and which they are. Forced temporary marriages, sexual slavery, girls impregnated by militants and then abandoned and then ostracized from their communities is all too rampant, and we see this often. This has introduced many gender-specific constraints in their reintegration and ability to rebuild their lives that's very unique from the experience that we've seen with boys and young men. But the other role that women and girls also play that is often overlooked is the role of perpetrators. And we support girls who were fighters and informants and porters or domestic workers, but in that process have adopted extreme ideologies. Women and girls face systemic gender-based violence, discrimination, and marginalization in Somalia, which was recently ranked as one of the worst places on earth to be a woman. So groups like Al-Shabaab take advantage of this by selectively targeting women and girls under the auspice that they can offer protection and justice under Sharia law, or in physically arming them to defend themselves. For girls who have been raped without any accountability for their perpetrator, being armed and joining Al-Shabaab is as much of a means of self-preservation and protection as it is the way of vengeance and inflicting pain on those that inflicted pain on you. We do a lot of work on women and girls that have been sexually exploited and abused by foreign troops as well in Somalia. And I want to give you an example of what happened a couple years ago where there was a very public case in Somalia of a young woman who was kidnapped by Somali forces, taken to an AU base, was raped, and then tossed out to the street naked. And she was very public about her sexual abuse by the AU forces, and it caused an outrage in the country. And this is one of the uncomfortable truths that we have in our society too, where sexual violence is rampant, but when it's a non-Somali or a different actor, the society mobilizes a lot larger to collectively voice their concern about it. But what happened in this process when the AU and the Somali government collectively denied those allegations up front, Al-Shabaab capitalized on that. And they took to the radios and mobilizing people to send the message that not only did the infidels come to take over the country, but now they're pillaging and raping our women, so you must bomb, you must attack and revolt against the system. So I think it's also interesting to see that they have a unique ability to use gender issues when it suits their message. And this is something that needs to be carefully viewed as well. So we've looked at women as both victims, as perpetrators, but most importantly, they're champions. They are key actors in preventing violent extremism. And we work with mothers in Somalia to not only prevent violent extremism, but to start the conversation at homes. And this is something that I can discuss more in the panel as well. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm very glad to be here today again. I think that I kind of lose the authority on saying that young people don't get spaces when I got space twice in the same conference. Thank you for that. The world has never been this young. Today we have 1.8 billion people between the age of 10 to 24. Never again is there likely to be such a potential for economic and social progress. However, young population, especially in conflict and post-conflict context, is mostly viewed as instigators of violence and sometimes as a society's vulnerable section that needs protection. Even in yesterday's conversations, we heard a lot that the notion that youth need to be fixed and about the youth problem. And I think, and we think that this is actually the problem which needs to be fixed. We have to recognize young people as actors in peace building. Talking about my own experience in peace building and countering violent extremism, at Aware Girls, which is a youth-led organization, we have developed a youth peace network which focuses on preventing and countering violent extremism through promoting peace activism among young people and engaging young people as partners in promoting societal tolerance, pluralism, non-violence, and conflict resolution. We have developed a disengagement strategy which uses peer education, individual engagement, positive role models, indigenous narrative of non-violence, and mentorship as tools. I want to talk about the disengagement strategies a bit in detail, the way we use it, how well it is working. We engage young people in peer education. We have seen peer education as an effective tool for disengagement because when peers approach peers, they relate and connect easily to each other. They don't feel like being told what is right and what is wrong for them. Instead, they explore the phenomena and dynamics of an issue together and build knowledge together. Young people are more receptive to change their mindset through peer-to-peer approaches. Peer-to-peer approaches provide opportunities for personal engagement, for sharing and refining their grievances, hopes, and desires. Young people empathize with each other. They generally don't lecture to one another. Yesterday, we talked about role models and how being belonging to a group give youth an identity and a status which can act as a push factor or as a pull factor. Through the Youth Peace Network, which we have established, we glorify peace for youth. We make peace a matter of energy, adventure, and creativity. We have provided a network to young people with whom they can associate themselves and can build their identity as peace activists. It becomes a matter of status and pride for youth to be associated with such networks along with their peers and along with their comrades. Every year, the existing members of Youth Peace Network brings in their friends and peers for membership to the network. Their peers had seen them being associated with the network. They get inspired and they want to be associated with the same network. In 2009, we started with a group of only 30 young people. Today, we have 20 active groups in different parts of Pakistan and Afghanistan, reaching out to more than 3,000 young people annually. Networks like Youth Peace Network make youth feel significant, and it also helps them make dreams for a better path in life and for a peaceful society. Thus, it convinces them to contribute towards peace, justice, and equity in their communities. We believe that give youth a dream, and they will together use their synergies for bringing peace. When we work on countering extremism, we don't use counter narratives. For example, we don't tell them that Taliban or Daesh are killing people and killing is bad. And do you want to be a bad guy? We don't use this counter narrative because this is not helpful. They already know that Taliban and Daesh are killing people. And they already know that it's a business of killing and killing is bad. But they have been convinced and they have decided to do that business. So we don't go and tell them that what you are doing is wrong. So most of the counter narratives that we see are often general public repetitive messages. And they don't provide an opportunity of individuals' engagement. On the other hand, we have seen that the extremist organizations, they provide huge opportunity of individual engagement. If you see their Twitter post, for example, you will see 1,000 retweets. You will see the hashtag used by thousands of people. So they find an opportunity of individual engagement. And I think that is one of the pull factor for them. Let me give you an example from our very own context. In 2009, when Taliban were gaining control in Swat, when they were getting influence, do you know which was the biggest section of society which supported Taliban? Women. Women gave them the biggest support. Women would come out, they will give out their gold so that Taliban can get funds. Why women were giving their jewelry and gold? Because when we hear about Taliban are someone who oppresses women. So why in Swat, this is on record, why in Swat women were giving so much gold and their personal money without the permission of their husbands? And mind it, we live in a country where women don't even breathe without the permission of their husband. But they were giving out their gold without the permission of their husbands. Why? Because Taliban gave significance to a section of society which was ignored by the rest. There was free media then, but the media and the people, the civil society, no one was talking about women. No one was talking to women, even if they were talking about women. No one was talking to women. And when the Taliban leader, Maulana Fazlullah, when he started his radio channel, he specifically started a program in which he would talk to women, in which he would talk about women's issue. This was for the first time in the history of that place that someone gave significance to women. Someone started talking to women. Someone started talking about women's issues. Someone was responding to the questions of women. That is why women became their greatest consumers of the radio programs of Taliban, and they became their greatest supporters. So when we build narratives, mind it, that there are some really effective strategies which we often leave out. So when we talk about narratives to counter violent extremism, it is important that rather than countering narratives and telling people what they already know, we should ensure that we provide opportunities of individuals' engagement. We empathize with the young people and we offer significance. In our work, we engage young people in community dialogues, in intergenerational dialogues, interfaith dialogues, and activities which help them explore their own indigenous pluralistic discourse and indigenous movements of nonviolence. I work in the northwest of Pakistan where we had a very historical indigenous nonviolent movement. It was known as Khudai Khidmatgar movement, and the movement was developed in when people were struggling for freedom for British Raj. There was a local movement known as Khudai Khidmatgar, which was and young people were part of that movement, and they would go to the communities and they would mobilize them for social welfare and non-violent civic action. So when we work on countering violent extremism, we don't create new narratives. We use our own existing indigenous alternative narratives. And the indigenous narratives are powerful because people can see that we have not imported these narratives and these strategies from somewhere else. These are very local strategies. These are very local narratives which were developed by our own elders, by our own people. So they own it and they can see the relevance. Another effective disengagement strategy for youth is to provide them platforms and opportunities for building their own initiatives, small-scale initiatives. Research shows that small-scale local initiatives are more effective than large-scale programs in reducing violence. Through Youth Peace Network, as I had already said, that we engage young people as partners in peace building and countering violent extremism. So in the network, young people build their initiatives for PVE, CVE, or peace building, whatever you call it, and we support them. In the last 7 years, we have supported a range of initiatives of young people in the network, which included peace education programs, mediations of conflicts in the communities, interfaith dialogues, engaging madrasa students, and digital media campaigns. Besides working at grassroots level for peace building and countering violent extremism, young people are pushing global boundaries as well for peace building. In December 2016, United Nations Security Council passed a resolution recognizing the role of young people as important actors in peace building, Resolution 2250. The resolution recognized that young people, including Youth Peace Act, that young people are important actors in peace building, and young people, youth peace activists, especially organizations like United Network of Young Leaders, were one of the major force behind this resolution. We were working for years and years. We were convincing, we were building partnerships, and we were convincing the state members and development agencies that how important it is to have a global document, to have an international commitment which actually recognizes the role of young people as peace builders. And in December 2016, United Nations Security Council passed that resolution. And that is why young people like me are hopeful today, because for the first time in the history, UN adopted a resolution that focuses entirely on the role of young men and women in peace building and countering violent extremism. The resolution acknowledged the urgent need to engage young peace builders in promoting peace and countering extremism. The resolution also positioned youth and youth-led organizations as important partners in global efforts to counter violent extremism and promote lasting peace. This resolution is a major breakthrough in our collective efforts to change the predominantly negative narrative of youth and start recognizing their significant role in peace building. Now we look forward to the implementation of the Resolution 2250 on youth, peace and security. We urge that in partnership with the young people, national and regional action plans are developed for investment in young people, enabling them to fulfill their peace building potential. We look forward that countries find ways to meaningfully engage young people in decision-making processes at all levels, to engage young people in peace negotiations, and to engage young people in implementation of the peace agreements. We hope that measures are taken to support youth-led peace initiatives and that human rights of young people who are living in conflict or post-conflict zones are protected. We also hope that the agenda of CVE and the agenda of youth, peace and security is not used to shrink spaces for youth-led civil society organizations, but is used to create more civic spaces for youth-led organizations. I want to share a story of Farooq, and I want to tell you that why I believe that young people are important actors in peace building. It's not that because I'm a young person, that's why I think I should sit on the table and I should be doing everything. It's because of my experience. It's because I have seen these hundreds of young people just in my own community who are working for peace. I want to share story of Farooq. I have already shared some stories yesterday, but I want to share story of Farooq. Farooq is one of the peace activists now. He is a young person from the tribal areas of Pakistan, where Taliban had enjoyed control for a long time. Life for Farooq under the regime of Taliban was, as a young man, was very difficult because he didn't want to follow the Taliban code of life and the Taliban code of dress. So he would often stay at home because he didn't want to be seen outside not having beard and the Taliban dress code. But one day, Taliban raided his home and arrested him for not following the code. He was taken to the prison. Once he went to the prison, he saw dehumanizing behavior of Taliban. He got really frightened. That was a very traumatic experience to be in the prison of Taliban and seeing the dehumanizing behavior of Taliban with other prisoners. His brother had to pay a huge amount of money to release his brother. But as soon as he got released, he decided he will not live anymore in his village. And he moved to Peshawar, which was a Taliban free zone. So he moved there. But luckily, once he moved there, he got to meet other young people who were members of the Youth Peace Network. He was amazed to get connected with young people who were not seeing themselves as victims, but they were seeing themselves as actors in peace building, and they were reclaiming their spaces, their progressive spaces from extremist organizations. He decided that he will join the network. So he joined the network, and together with other young people, he started an initiative of young men to reclaim their spaces from extremist organizations. He went back with his group to his village. He talked with the elders, with the tribal elders, and he raised funds. And with those funds, he organized a youth sports festival in a time when it was difficult for people to come out in public spaces because of the fear of Taliban. At that time, he brought together elders, he brought together young people, and they organized their first sports festival. And they also used that festival to raise funds for education of children who couldn't afford to go to public schools and therefore were sent to Taliban madrasas by their parents. He started raising funds with his with his friends, and today their organization is sponsoring education of 300 students. And besides that, they're also imparting peace education in more than 10 local schools, because he's aware that the kind of education and the problems our education system has. So he with his team is also imparting peace education in more than 10 local schools. Farooq, through his local small-scale initiative, has become a role model for many. He is an example of being significant and relevant to his community. This is the power and potential of young people. That is why I believe in the power of young people. I invite all of you to go back to your community, find a Farooq, build partnership with him, support him, and together with him, build peace in your community. Thank you.